What if everything you've been taught about the dawn of civilization is backwards? What if the moment we call the birth of human society was actually humanity's desperate attempt to remember what it had lost? Tonight, we're going to uncover a story so profound, so earth-shattering, that it forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about our own origins. Before we dive into this journey through forgotten time, take a moment to engage with this exploration. Hit that like button if you're ready to question the foundations of human history, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I want to imagine this revelation spreading across time zones, reaching minds ready to confront uncomfortable truths about our past. Deep beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets that tell an impossible story. These aren't the ravings of primitive minds or the fantasies of ancient storytellers. These are administrative records, genealogical documents, and historical chronicles written by the world's first bureaucrats. People who counted grain, tracked livestock, and recorded the movements of stars with mathematical precision that rivals our own. Yet embedded within these meticulous records is a narrative so strange, so unsettling, that most scholars have chosen to dismiss it rather than confront its implications. It's the story of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, of a great flood that divided history itself, of a lineage that connected mortal rulers to beings described as divine. And at the centre of it all stands one figure whose very existence bridges two worlds, the world that was and the world that emerged from its ashes. His name appears in the oldest story ever written. You think you know him from school textbooks and Hollywood adaptations, but the Gilgamesh you've been taught about is a pale shadow of something far more extraordinary. The real story, the one carved into clay by people who lived in the aftermath of unimaginable catastrophe, reveals him not as a mythical hero, but as the last surviving king of a bloodline that predates recorded history. The ancient scribes who recorded his deeds didn't call him fully human. They described him with a mathematical precision that should make us pause. 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal. Not half God, not blessed by the gods, but carrying within his very being the genetic and cultural memory of something that came before, something that ended in fire and flood 13,000 years ago. This isn't mythology. This is trauma encoded in the world's first literature, because what these ancient records are really describing is humanity's response to the most devastating event our species has ever survived. An event so catastrophic that it reset not just civilization, but the very climate of our planet. An event that modern science has now confirmed through ice cores, sediment layers, and the extinction record itself. We call it the Younger Dryas impact event. The ancients called it the flood that swept over the earth. Same event, different names. A cosmic catastrophe that ended the last ice age, triggered massive climate change, and wiped out entire cultures across the globe. The difference is that modern science discovered it through careful analysis of geological evidence. The ancients lived through it, through when fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the northern hemisphere 12,800 years ago. They didn't just kill the mammoths and saber-toothed cats. They ended a world that had developed its own forms of knowledge, architecture, and social organization. A world that left behind survivors who carried fragments of that lost civilization into whatever came next. Those survivors didn't start from scratch. They started from memory, incomplete, traumatized, but profound memory of what had been lost, and when they finally rebuilt, when the climate stabilized and agriculture became possible, they didn't create civilization slowly and gradually as we've been taught. They exploded into history with cities writing systems and administrative structures that appeared almost overnight. The first of these post-catastrophe cities was Uruk, not a village that grew into a town that became a city, but a massive urban centre that erupted fully formed on the plains of ancient Mesopotamia. 6 square kilometres of walls, temples and workshops that housed tens of thousands of people, organised under complex bureaucratic systems. This wasn't the beginning of civilization. This was civilization remembering itself. And ruling over this remarkable city was a king whose bloodline, according to the ancient records, reached back to the world before the flood. A king whose story has been retold for over 4,000 years not because he was fictional, but because he represented something essential about the human experience. The last bridge between what we were and what we became. The Sumerian king list, one of the most enigmatic documents from the ancient world, divides all of history into 2 periods, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, kings ruled for impossible lengths of time, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, their reigns collapsed to human proportions. Something fundamental changed at that moment, something that transformed not just individual lifespans, but the entire nature of rulership and authority. Gilgamesh appears in this record at exactly the transition point. He's the first king after the Great Reset who still carries the mathematical designation of divine blood. Yet he's also the first to confront mortality in the visceral, terrifying way that defines the human condition. He's living proof that something extraordinary preceded the world we know, and something catastrophic ended it. Modern archaeology has struggled to explain why complex civilization appeared so suddenly after the end of the last ice age. Traditional models suggest that agriculture led to surplus, surplus led to specialization, and specialization gradually built up the infrastructure of cities and states. But the archaeological record doesn't support this gradual progression. Instead, we see explosive development that looks more like recovery than invention. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, massive stone temples were constructed by people who supposedly hadn't even invented pottery yet. These aren't the crude monuments of primitive hunter-gatherers. They're sophisticated architectural achievements that required advanced planning, skilled craftsmanship, and coordinated labour forces. Then, mysteriously, the entire complex was deliberately buried as if its builders were preserving it for some future discovery. This pattern repeats across the post-glacial world. Sudden appearances of complex societies with no clear developmental pathway. Advanced knowledge systems that seem to emerge fully formed. Architectural techniques that suggest familiarity with principles that wouldn't be invented for centuries. It's as if the survivors of some earlier tradition were working from fragmented blueprints, trying to reconstruct something they remembered, but could no longer fully comprehend. The ancient texts themselves hint at this interpretation. When Sumerian scribes wrote about the origins of their knowledge, they didn't claim to have invented it. They said it was given to them, handed down from beings they called the Anunnaki, a term that has been wildly misinterpreted in modern times but originally meant something much simpler. The princely offspring, the noble bloodline, the ones who carried authority from an earlier age. These weren't extraterrestrial visitors or supernatural deities in the modern sense. They were the cultural memory of survivors, people who had lived through the end of one world and carried fragments of its wisdom into the next. Their knowledge seemed divine to later generations, not because they came from the stars, but because they remembered things that everyone else had forgotten. This is where the story of Gilgamesh becomes not just ancient history, but a mirror for our own deepest fears and aspirations. Because embedded within his epic is humanity's first meditation on mortality, loss, and the desperate desire to preserve something meaningful in the face of inevitable destruction. His journey isn't just the quest of one king for personal immortality. It's the coded story of how our species learned to survive catastrophe by encoding memory into permanent forms. When Gilgamesh loses his closest friend and confronts the reality of death, his response is to seek out the one man who survived the Great Flood, not because he's looking for a fairy tale, but because he's searching for practical wisdom about how to endure when everything familiar collapses. The flood survivor he finds doesn't offer him magical solutions or divine interventions. Instead, he tells the story of how knowledge and life itself can be preserved through careful preparation and difficult choices. The ark in this ancient flood narrative isn't just a boat for saving animals. It's a metaphor for the preservation of civilization itself, the careful selection of what to save and what to sacrifice when the old world ends and a new one must begin. This is the deeper meaning buried within humanity's oldest story. Not divine punishment or supernatural intervention, but practical wisdom about survival, continuity, and the price of starting over. What makes this ancient narrative so compelling is how precisely it matches what modern science has discovered about the Younger Dryas impact event. The sudden climate change, the mass extinctions, the evidence of cosmic impact, the abrupt end of established cultures, and the mysterious appearance of new forms of human organization in the aftermath. The geological record and the mythological record are telling the same story from different perspectives. But this raises a profound question that we're only beginning to confront. If our ancestors really did survive a planetary catastrophe of this magnitude, what does that mean for our understanding of human potential and human vulnerability? What capabilities did we once possess that we've forgotten? What knowledge did we lose that we're still trying to rediscover? And most importantly, what can we learn from their experience about our own prospects for survival in an uncertain world? The answers to these questions lie not just in archaeological sites and ancient texts, but in the very structure of human memory and the patterns of how civilizations rise and fall. Because the story of the last Anunnaki King isn't just about the distant past. It's about the eternal human struggle to preserve meaning and knowledge in the face of forces that seem determined to erase both. As we dig deeper into this forgotten chapter of human history, we'll discover that the line between myth and reality is far thinner than we've been taught to believe. The cosmic catastrophe that ended the last ice age wasn't just a geological event. It was a transformative moment that shaped everything from our earliest religious traditions to our deepest psychological patterns. Understanding this event means understanding ourselves in ways that no previous generation has been able to achieve. The clay tablets are still speaking to us across 5,000 years. The question is whether we're finally ready to listen to what they're really trying to say about who we were, who we became, and who we might still become again. The evidence begins with names carved into clay by hands that trembled with memory. When archaeologists first translated the Sumerian king list in the 19th century, they assumed they were reading mythology disguised as history. The numbers seemed impossible, the reigns absurd, the entire document a primitive attempt to glorify ancient rulers through divine fantasy. Then they kept digging. And what they found changed everything. In the ruins of Nippur, buried beneath centuries of accumulated sand, lay a humble administrative tablet. Not a grand epic or religious hymn, but a construction invoice. A bureaucratic record stating simply that Gilgamesh and his son Nungal had rebuilt the temple walls for the goddess Enlil. This wasn't poetry. This was accounting. You don't put fictional characters on a government expense report. Similar discoveries followed. Cylinder seals bearing the inscription, "Servant of Gilgamesh." Legal documents mentioning citizens with names that honored the king of Uruk. Trade records, property deeds, administrative appointments. Piece by piece the myth dissolved, and the man emerged. Gilgamesh had existed. His city had flourished. His projects had left physical traces that modern archaeology could verify. But this created a deeper mystery. If Gilgamesh was real, how much of his story was real? If the king existed, what about the flood he sought to understand? If the administrative records were accurate, what about the impossible reign length that preceded his rule? Most troubling of all, if the mathematical precision of 2/3 divine wasn't poetic license, what exactly were the ancient scribes trying to preserve? The answer lies in understanding what divinity meant to people who had lived through the end of the world. To us, divine blood sounds supernatural, mystical, impossible. To them, it was a genealogical category, a way of saying that certain lineages carried something the others had lost. Not magical powers or immortal lifespans, but cultural memory, knowledge systems, technological understanding, the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that no longer existed. When the Younger Dryas impact fragments struck the northern hemisphere, they didn't just kill animals and destroy forests. They severed the transmission of knowledge. Libraries burned, schools collapsed, trade networks disintegrated, and the specialists who maintained complex technologies died or scattered. What survived was fragments carried by small groups of people who had the foresight, the resources, or the simple luck to endure the catastrophe. These survivors weren't starting from zero. They were starting from fragments, incomplete blueprints for irrigation systems, half-remembered astronomical calculations, partial understanding of metallurgy, architecture, and administrative organization. Enough to rebuild, but not enough to fully recreate what had been lost. The result was civilizations that appeared to burst into history fully formed, yet carried within them the scars of incompleteness. Uruk represents the most successful of these reconstruction projects. When you walk through its excavated ruins today, you're not seeing humanity's first attempt at urban planning. You're seeing humanity's first successful attempt to remember urban planning. The 6-kilometer walls weren't built by people learning construction techniques through trial and error. They were built by people following half-remembered principles of defensive architecture. The writing system that appeared at Uruk tells the same story. Cuneiform didn't evolve slowly from simple pictographs to complex administrative notation. It erupted as a fully functional bureaucratic tool capable of recording everything from tax receipts to astronomical observations. This wasn't innovation. This was recovery. The urgent reconstruction of a communication system that had once existed in more complete form. Even more telling are the massive temple complexes at the heart of the city. These weren't the crude shrines of primitive agriculturalists slowly learning to honor their gods. They were sophisticated architectural achievements that demonstrated advanced knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and ceremonial space design. The Anu Ziggurat, with its precise orientation to celestial events, shows understanding of astronomical principles that wouldn't be rediscovered by other cultures for thousands of years. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from the beveled rim bowls found throughout Uruk and other early Mesopotamian sites. Thousands upon thousands of these simple ceramic containers, all manufactured to identical specifications, all used for standardized food rations. This represents something extraordinary: mass production, quality control, and systematic labor management appearing at the very dawn of recorded history. These bowls tell us that the builders of Uruk didn't just know how to make pottery. They understood industrial organization, workforce logistics, and economic standardization. They knew how to feed large numbers of specialized workers engaged in coordinated construction projects. This wasn't primitive craftsmanship slowly improving over generations. This was sophisticated organizational knowledge being applied immediately and effectively. The same pattern emerges when we examine early Mesopotamian mathematics. The base 60 numerical system that appeared with the first cities wasn't a random cultural choice. It was an inherited system perfectly suited for astronomical calculation, geometric construction, and complex administrative accounting. Every aspect of this mathematical framework suggests prior development, prior application, prior refinement across extended periods of use. Modern attempts to reverse engineer ancient construction techniques consistently reveal knowledge systems more sophisticated than expected. The precise stone cutting at early temple sites, the complex water management systems that appeared alongside the first agricultural settlements, the astronomical alignments embedded in ceremonial architecture. Each discovery points toward the same conclusion. These weren't primitive people slowly inventing civilization. These were survivors of catastrophe rapidly rebuilding it. The most dramatic evidence comes from Göbekli Tepe, the temple complex in southeastern Turkey that predates agriculture itself. Massive stone pillars arranged in precise geometric patterns, carved with intricate animal reliefs, constructed by people who supposedly lived as simple hunter-gatherers. The engineering required to quarry, transport, and erect these monuments rivals anything achieved by later Bronze Age civilizations. Then mysteriously the entire complex was deliberately buried, not abandoned, not destroyed by enemies, but carefully covered with tons of soil and rubble, as if its builders were preserving it, creating a time capsule, ensuring that future generations would eventually uncover evidence of what had been possible before the world changed. This pattern of deliberate preservation appears throughout the post-catastrophe archaeological record. Knowledge encoded in permanent materials, information systems designed to survive cultural collapse, architectural principles embedded in stone foundations that would endure long after the societies that built them had faded into memory. The ancient scribes who recorded the Sumerian king list understood this principle. They weren't trying to deceive future readers or aggrandize their rulers. They were creating a permanent record of the transition between two worlds. The world before the flood, where different rules applied, where knowledge systems operated on scales we can barely comprehend, and the world after the flood, where survivors worked desperately to preserve and rebuild what had been lost. Gilgamesh appears in this record at the precise moment of transition, the last king to carry the biological and cultural inheritance of the pre-catastrophe world, the first to rule in the post-catastrophe reality where death, scarcity, and forgetting had become the dominant human experiences. His 2/3 divine nature wasn't supernatural. It was genealogical, a mathematical expression of how much pre-flood knowledge his lineage had managed to preserve. This interpretation explains why his story became humanity's first great literature, not because he was fictional, but because he represented something essential about the human condition after catastrophe, the burden of carrying incomplete memories of a better world, the responsibility of preserving knowledge for future generations, the tragic recognition that everything, no matter how magnificent, eventually ends. When Gilgamesh confronts mortality in the epic, he's not just facing personal death. He's confronting the mortality of knowledge itself, the recognition that what his lineage remembered would die with him unless it could be encoded into more permanent forms. His desperate quest for immortality becomes humanity's desperate quest to preserve meaning across the gap between worlds. The flood survivor he seeks out in the epic represents the living link to the pre-catastrophe world, Not a mythological figure, but the embodiment of cultural memory. Someone who had witnessed the transition, survived the collapse, and carried forward the essential knowledge needed for Reconstruction. The conversation between them isn't fantasy. It's the last generation of survivors passing wisdom to the first generation of rebuilders. This is why the flood narrative embedded within the Gilgamesh epic matches so precisely with geological evidence for the Younger Dryas impact event. The ancient storytellers weren't inventing a catastrophe. They were preserving the memory of one, encoding within mythological language the practical knowledge that future generations would need to understand their own origins and prepare for their own challenges. The arc in their flood story wasn't just about saving animals, it was about saving knowledge. The careful selection of what could be preserved when everything familiar was being destroyed. The hard choices about what to carry forward and what to sacrifice. The wisdom of preparation, the necessity of sacrifice, and the possibility of beginning again. Understanding this transforms how we read not just ancient literature but ancient history itself. The sudden appearance of complex civilizations after the end of the last ice age wasn't miraculous. It was the result of systematic knowledge preservation by people who understood that catastrophe was always possible, and that survival required more than just individual endurance. The Anunnaki mentioned throughout Mesopotamian texts weren't extraterrestrial visitors or supernatural beings. They were the cultural memory of the knowledge bearers who had bridged the catastrophe. People whose understanding of agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and administration seemed divine to later generations precisely because it represented wisdom from a world that no longer existed. Their gradual disappearance from later texts reflects not their return to the stars, but the natural process by which direct cultural memory fades into legend. As the post-catastrophe world stabilized, as new knowledge systems developed, as the immediate trauma of survival gave way to the routines of established civilization, the memory of what had been lost became increasingly abstract. By the time scribes were copying the Epic of Gilgamesh in the great libraries of Babylon and Assyria, they were already working with inherited traditions whose origins they only partially understood. They preserved the stories with extraordinary care, but the living context that had given them meaning was fading. What remained was literature of extraordinary power, whose deeper significance would only become clear when modern science rediscovered the catastrophe that had inspired it. This is the true legacy of the last Anunnaki King. Not supernatural power or divine authority, but the preservation of memory across the gap between worlds. The encoding of survival wisdom into permanent forms that could guide future generations through their own challenges and catastrophes. The deeper we excavate into these ancient memories, the more we realize that humanity's relationship with catastrophe is not random or accidental. It's cyclical, predictable, and encoded into the very structures of how we organize society, preserve knowledge, and prepare for the future. The survivors of the Younger Dryas impact didn't just rebuild civilization. They redesigned it specifically to endure the next collapse. When you examine the architectural choices made at sites like Uruk, you're not seeing aesthetic preferences or religious symbolism. You're seeing engineering decisions made by people who understood that permanence requires specific materials, specific techniques, specific orientations. The massive fired brick walls weren't built to impress neighbors. They were built to survive millennia. The deep foundations weren't architectural flourishes. They were calculated responses to the knowledge that surface structures can be swept away by forces beyond human control. The writing system they developed reveals the same strategic thinking. Clay tablets weren't chosen because they were convenient or cheap. They were chosen because they're virtually indestructible. Fire hardens them. Water can't dissolve them. Time preserves them better than any other medium available to ancient peoples. When you're encoding knowledge for future generations who might face similar catastrophes, durability matters more than elegance. Even more sophisticated was their approach to information redundancy. Critical knowledge wasn't stored in single locations or entrusted to individual specialists. It was distributed across multiple sites, copied by multiple scribes, embedded in multiple formats. Religious texts, administrative records, astronomical observations, mathematical tables. The same essential information encoded in different contexts, preserved through different institutions, maintained by different social groups. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic preparation for cultural discontinuity. The survivors of one catastrophe teaching the rebuilders how to prepare for the next one. They understood something we're only beginning to rediscover, that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can be lost, and that survival requires more than just individual adaptation. The astronomical knowledge preserved in early Mesopotamian texts provides perhaps the clearest evidence of this systematic approach. These weren't primitive peoples slowly learning to track the seasons. These were survivors working with inherited observational data that spanned centuries, possibly millennia. The precision of their planetary calculations, the accuracy of their eclipse predictions, the sophistication of their calendar systems, all point toward continuous astronomical observation across periods longer than any single culture could maintain. What we're seeing is the inheritance of a scientific tradition that predated the catastrophe. Not complete inheritance, not perfect preservation, but enough continuity to produce results that modern astronomy recognizes as remarkably accurate. The gaps in their knowledge are as telling as the knowledge itself. Certain calculations preserved with extraordinary precision, other information missing entirely. The pattern of someone working from incomplete but sophisticated source material. The same fragmentation appears in their metallurgical knowledge. Advanced alloy formulations appearing alongside primitive smelting techniques. Sophisticated tool designs manufactured with inconsistent methods. The hallmarks of inherited technology being reconstructed by people who understood the principles but had lost the infrastructure to implement them fully. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of early civilization: the appearance of advanced knowledge in contexts that seem too early, too primitive, too isolated to support such development. Bronze working appearing before the Bronze Age. Astronomical precision preceding systematic mathematics. Urban planning existing before agriculture was fully established. Not anomalies, but evidence of knowledge inheritance from a more sophisticated predecessor culture. The flood narratives preserved throughout the ancient world serve as both historical record and practical manual for this inheritance process. They're not just describing what happened during the catastrophe. They're encoding instructions for how to prepare for similar events, the careful selection of what to preserve, the importance of advanced warning systems, the necessity of portable, self-sustaining communities, the techniques for maintaining knowledge across generational gaps. When Gilgamesh seeks out the flood survivor in the epic, he's not looking for magical solutions to personal mortality. He's seeking practical wisdom about institutional survival. How does knowledge persist when the institutions that maintain it collapse? How do you rebuild complex systems when most of the specialists are gone? How do you distinguish between essential and expendable elements when everything familiar is being destroyed? The answers the flood survivor provides are remarkably practical. Prepare in advance, maintain redundant systems, preserve diversity, accept that not everything can be saved, focus on what's essential for restarting rather than what's comfortable for continuing. These aren't mystical teachings or religious doctrines. They're emergency management protocols developed by people who had lived through the end of their world. The gradual transformation of these practical instructions into religious and mythological narratives reflects the natural process by which survival knowledge becomes cultural tradition. As the immediate threat recedes, as new generations grow up without direct experience of catastrophe, the urgent practical guidance becomes ritualized, symbolized, mythologized. The content is preserved, but its original context becomes increasingly abstract. This transformation process explains why ancient religious traditions contain so much practical wisdom about community organization, resource management, and social coordination. These weren't arbitrary rules imposed by supernatural authorities. They were survival strategies developed by people who understood that human societies face recurring challenges that require systematic preparation and coordinated response. The astronomical alignments built into ancient temple complexes serve a similar dual function. Yes, they demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, but they also serve as permanent calendars, navigation aids, and timekeeping systems that can function independently of specialized knowledge or complex institutions. If the priests disappear, if the schools close, if the libraries burn, the buildings themselves continue to mark the seasons, predict the floods, and maintain the basic temporal framework that agricultural societies require. This redundant encoding of essential information into permanent architectural forms represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of post-catastrophe civilization design. Knowledge preserved not just in text that can be lost or destroyed, but in stone structures that will endure for millennia, information systems that can be read by future generations, even if the language and culture that created them are completely forgotten. The precision required to achieve this dual functionality explains why early monumental architecture appears so suddenly and so sophisticatedly in the archaeological record. These weren't primitive peoples slowly learning construction techniques through trial and error. These were people working with inherited architectural principles specifically designed to serve multiple functions across extended time periods. The social organization required to implement such projects reveals similar sophistication. The coordination of specialized labor forces, the management of resource extraction and transportation, the integration of technical, administrative, and ceremonial functions, the development of symbolic systems that could communicate complex information across cultural and linguistic boundaries, all appearing within centuries of the end of the last ice age. This rapid development makes sense only if we understand it as reconstruction rather than initial construction. People working with fragmented but sophisticated institutional memory, trying to rebuild systems they remembered but couldn't fully replicate. The successes are impressive. The failures are equally instructive. The gaps in their knowledge reveal as much about their predecessors as their achievements. Archaeological evidence from sites across the post-glacial world shows the same pattern of rapid, sophisticated development, followed by gradual decline and eventual abandonment. Göbekli Tepe, deliberately buried after centuries of use. Çatalhöyük, mysteriously abandoned at the height of its development. Early Mesopotamian cities, rebuilt multiple times on the same foundations before finally being left to the desert. This isn't the normal pattern of civilizational growth and decline. It's the pattern of emergency reconstruction followed by the gradual loss of the knowledge that made such reconstruction possible. Each generation further removed from the catastrophe, each generation with less direct access to the inherited wisdom, each generation more dependent on incomplete copies of increasingly abstract traditions. The Sumerian king list documents this process with mathematical precision. the impossibly long reigns before the flood representing the institutional memory of the pre-catastrophe world, the abrupt transition to human-scale reigns after the flood marking the moment when direct cultural inheritance ends and normal historical development begins. Gilgamesh positioned exactly at this transition, carrying the last genetic and cultural connection to the earlier world, while ruling in the new reality of limited lifespans and forgotten knowledge. His epic becomes humanity's first meditation on this transition, the recognition that something extraordinary had been lost, that the current world was diminished compared to what had come before, and that individual human effort might not be sufficient to recover what had been destroyed. But also the recognition that knowledge could be preserved in new forms, that stories could carry wisdom across generational gaps, and that the struggle to maintain meaning in the face of loss was itself meaningful. The profound psychological impact of this realization echoes throughout all subsequent human culture. The sense that we're living in the aftermath of something greater, that our current knowledge is incomplete, our current institutions fragile, our current achievements modest compared to what might once have been possible. This isn't just ancient trauma. This is the foundational human experience of living after catastrophe, of rebuilding from fragments, of carrying incomplete memories of a better world. Understanding this transforms how we interpret not just ancient history, but our own position in the larger arc of human development. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement slowly advancing towards some predetermined destiny. We're the latest in a series of reconstruction efforts, working with inherited knowledge systems that we only partially understand, trying to preserve and extend wisdom that originates from sources we can barely remember. This perspective makes the ancient warnings about cyclical catastrophe seem less like primitive superstition and more like hard-won practical wisdom. The recognition that what has happened before will happen again, that what can be built can be destroyed, and that survival requires not just individual preparation, but systematic cultural preservation across generations. The cosmic impact that ended the Younger Dryas wasn't just a geological event. It was a reset button that forced humanity to develop entirely new approaches to knowledge preservation, social organization, and technological development. The civilizations that emerged in its aftermath weren't primitive beginnings. They were sophisticated responses to the challenge of maintaining human culture in a world where catastrophe was always possible. The legacy of the last Anunnaki King isn't just literary or historical, it's practical. The demonstration that human societies can survive seemingly insurmountable challenges, that knowledge can be preserved across seemingly impossible gaps, and that the work of reconstruction is not just possible but necessary. Each generation inherits fragments from the previous one, and has the responsibility to preserve and extend those fragments for future generations. This understanding makes our current global challenges seem both more daunting and more manageable. More daunting because they reveal how quickly sophisticated civilizations can collapse when their supporting systems fail. More manageable because they demonstrate that humans have faced existential challenges before and developed effective strategies for survival and recovery. The question isn't whether we'll face future catastrophes. The question is whether we'll learn from the wisdom encoded in humanity's oldest stories, prepare our knowledge systems for discontinuity, and develop the cultural resilience that allowed our ancestors to survive the end of their world and begin ours. The deeper you dig into these ancient records, the more unsettling the patterns become. Because what we're discovering isn't just evidence of one lost civilization. We're uncovering traces of a knowledge system so sophisticated, so systematically organized, that it challenges everything we think we understand about the progression of human learning. When linguists first began deciphering cuneiform in the 19th century, They expected to find simple records gradually increasing in complexity over time. Instead, they found the opposite. The earliest tablets demonstrate mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched again for thousands of years. Base 60 calculations that still govern our measurement of time and angles. Astronomical observations accurate to decimal points. Administrative systems that tracked resources across vast territories with bureaucratic efficiency that rivals modern governments. This wasn't primitive bookkeeping slowly improving through trial and error. This was institutional knowledge operating at maximum capacity from the moment it appears in the archaeological record. The scribes who pressed these marks into wet clay weren't learning their craft. They were applying it with the confidence of people working within established traditions. The mathematical tablets from Babylon reveal calculations so advanced that modern scholars initially dismissed them as impossible for their time period. Pythagorean triples appearing 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Square root approximations using iterative methods identical to modern algorithms. Geometric series that wouldn't be formally described until the Renaissance. These weren't accidental discoveries. They were systematic applications of inherited mathematical principles. Even more telling are the astronomical texts that demonstrate continuous observation, spanning periods far longer than any individual human lifetime. The Venus tablets that track planetary cycles with precision requiring generations of careful measurement. Eclipse prediction tables that work backwards and forwards across centuries. Star catalogues that account for the slow, processional drift of constellations across millennia. This level of observational continuity suggests institutional memory stretching back far beyond the traditional dates for the beginning of civilization. Either these early peoples possessed lifespans that defied human biology, or they were working with inherited data from observational programs that had been maintained across much longer time periods than conventional history allows. The architectural evidence tells the same story. When you examine the foundation stones of the earliest Mesopotamian temples, you don't find experimental construction techniques or gradually improving masonry skills. You find sophisticated engineering principles applied with immediate confidence. Load-bearing calculations that demonstrate advanced understanding of structural mechanics. Drainage systems that reveal hydraulic knowledge typically associated with much later periods. Astronomical alignments that require precise understanding of celestial mechanics. The great ziggurat complexes weren't built by people slowly learning architecture through generational improvement. They were built by people applying inherited construction principles to create permanent monuments that could serve multiple functions across extended time periods. Each massive structure was simultaneously temple, observatory, administrative center, and emergency shelter. Multi-purpose buildings designed by people who understood that institutions must be prepared for disruption. The irrigation systems that supported these early cities reveal similar sophistication. Canal networks that managed water flow across hundreds of square kilometers. Flood control mechanisms that could handle seasonal variations and extreme weather events. Agricultural scheduling systems that maximized crop yields while maintaining soil fertility across generations. This wasn't primitive farming slowly improving through local experience. This was systematic application of hydraulic engineering principles. The social organization required to implement such projects appears equally sophisticated. Legal codes that addressed complex commercial relationships. Administrative hierarchies that could coordinate specialized labor across multiple projects, educational systems that could train scribes, engineers, and administrators, diplomatic protocols that could manage relationships between independent city-states, all appearing within centuries of the supposed beginning of civilization. This rapid institutional development makes sense only as reconstruction, rather than initial construction. People working with fragmented memories of more complete systems, trying to rebuild institutional structures they remembered but couldn't fully replicate. The successes demonstrate the sophistication of what they were trying to recover. The gaps reveal how much had been lost. The linguistic evidence provides perhaps the clearest indication of this inheritance pattern. Sumerian stands completely alone among human languages. No known relatives, no evolutionary pathway, no developmental stages. It appears fully formed with complex grammar, sophisticated vocabulary, and systematic writing conventions. This isn't how languages normally develop. This is what languages look like when they've been preserved across cultural discontinuity. The technical vocabulary embedded within Sumerian reveals knowledge systems that seem too advanced for their supposed time period. Metallurgical terms that describe alloy compositions not formally understood until modern chemistry. Astronomical terminology that requires mathematical concepts not officially developed until much later periods. Medical vocabulary that demonstrates anatomical knowledge typically associated with systematic dissection programs. These weren't casual observations gradually accumulating into technical knowledge. This was systematic scientific terminology preserved within a language structure specifically designed to maintain technical precision across generational transmission. The entire linguistic system appears optimized for knowledge preservation rather than casual communication. The religious and mythological texts embedded within this technical literature serve a similar preservation function. Complex narratives that encode practical information about resource management, social organization, and emergency preparedness. Stories that seem fantastical on the surface, but contain detailed instructions for maintaining civilization across periods of crisis and reconstruction. The flood narratives that appear throughout Mesopotamian literature aren't just describing past catastrophes, they're encoding systematic protocols for surviving future ones, the careful selection of what to preserve, the importance of portable knowledge systems, the necessity of maintaining genetic and cultural diversity, the techniques for rebuilding institutional structures after social collapse. When you strip away the mythological language, these ancient texts read like emergency management manuals written by people who had lived through civilizational collapse and wanted to ensure their descendants would be prepared for similar challenges. The practical wisdom encoded within religious narratives reveals understanding of social dynamics, resource allocation, and crisis management that seems remarkably sophisticated for supposedly primitive peoples. The archaeological evidence from sites across the ancient world shows the same pattern of sophisticated knowledge appearing suddenly and then gradually declining over time. Advanced construction techniques that were never improved upon by later generations. Mathematical principles that were applied but not extended. Astronomical observations that were recorded but not developed into more comprehensive theoretical frameworks. This isn't the normal pattern of technological development. This is the pattern of inherited knowledge being applied by people who understood the techniques, but not the underlying principles that had generated them. Each generation further removed from the original source, each generation working with increasingly incomplete copies of increasingly abstract instructions. The deliberate burial of sites like Göbekli Tepe reveals conscious efforts to preserve knowledge across anticipated periods of cultural discontinuity. These weren't communities abandoning failed projects. These were communities creating time capsules, ensuring that future generations would eventually rediscover evidence of capabilities that might otherwise be forgotten entirely. The same preservation strategy appears in the redundant encoding of critical information across multiple formats and institutions, Essential knowledge wasn't entrusted to single repositories or individual specialists. It was distributed across multiple sites, embedded in multiple contexts, maintained through multiple social structures. This systematic redundancy suggests people who understood that knowledge systems are fragile, and that preservation requires multiple backup systems. The astronomical alignments built into ancient monuments served this same function. Knowledge encoded in permanent architectural forms that could function independently of written records or specialized institutions. If the libraries burned, if the schools closed, if the priesthood disappeared, the buildings themselves would continue to mark the seasons, predict the floods, and maintain the basic observational framework that agricultural societies require. This approach to knowledge preservation reveals understanding of civilizational fragility that seems remarkably mature for supposedly early peoples. They weren't just building for their own generation. They were building for future generations who might face similar challenges and might need to reconstruct similar solutions. The entire architectural program appears designed to serve as a permanent backup system for human knowledge. The social institutions that supported these preservation efforts reveal similar sophistication. Educational systems that could maintain technical traditions across multiple generations. Legal frameworks that could protect specialized knowledge while allowing for its practical application. Economic structures that could support long-term projects without immediate practical returns. Political organizations that could coordinate resource allocation across multiple communities and extended time periods. These weren't primitive societies slowly learning social organization through trial and error. These were mature institutional structures specifically designed to maintain complex knowledge systems across periods of potential disruption. The entire social framework appears optimized for cultural continuity rather than short-term efficiency. The gradual decline of these sophisticated systems over subsequent centuries reveals the natural entropy that affects all human institutions. As immediate survival pressures decreased, as new generations grew up without direct experience of catastrophe, as the original purposes behind preservation efforts became increasingly abstract, the systematic maintenance of inherited knowledge became increasingly difficult to sustain. The transformation of practical survival protocols into religious and mythological traditions reflects this natural process of institutional decay. The content was preserved, but its original context became increasingly symbolic. Future generations inherited the forms but lost understanding of their original functions. What had been systematic preparation became ritualized tradition. This pattern of knowledge inheritance followed by gradual decline appears throughout subsequent human history. The classical civilizations that inherited fragments from their predecessors. The medieval institutions that preserved classical knowledge without fully understanding its applications. The Renaissance recovery of ancient texts whose original context had been forgotten. Each cycle represents another attempt to reconstruct inherited wisdom whose original sources had become increasingly remote. Understanding this cyclical pattern transforms how we interpret our own position in human development. We're not the first generation to work with inherited knowledge systems we only partially understand. We're not the first to face the challenge of maintaining complex institutions across periods of potential disruption. We're not the first to wonder whether our current achievements represent progress, or merely the latest attempt at reconstruction. The ancient warnings about cyclical catastrophe take on new meaning when viewed from this perspective. Not primitive superstition about angry gods, but practical wisdom about the recurring challenges that human societies face. The recognition that what has been built can be destroyed, that what has been learned can be forgotten, and that each generation inherits both the achievements and the responsibilities of those who came before. The story of Gilgamesh becomes humanity's first systematic meditation on these themes, the recognition that individual human life is brief, that institutional knowledge is fragile, and that the preservation of meaning across time requires conscious effort and systematic preparation. His quest for immortality represents not personal vanity, but species-wide concern about the continuity of knowledge and culture across generational boundaries. The flood survivor he seeks represents the living embodiment of successful knowledge transmission, someone who had witnessed the end of one world and carried essential wisdom into the next. Their conversation encodes practical instructions about how to maintain cultural continuity across periods of catastrophic disruption, how to identify what's essential for preservation, how to maintain hope during periods of collapse, how to begin the work of reconstruction when everything familiar has been destroyed. These aren't abstract philosophical themes. These are practical survival strategies developed by people who understood that human societies face recurring existential challenges. The encoding of such strategies into permanent literary form represents one of humanity's most sophisticated achievements. The creation of knowledge preservation systems that could function across cultural boundaries, linguistic changes, and institutional collapse. The clay tablets that preserved this ancient wisdom outlasted the libraries that housed them, the scribes who copied them, and the civilizations that created them. They survived because they were designed to survive, created using materials and methods specifically chosen for maximum durability across extended time periods. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic preparation for cultural discontinuity by people who understood that preservation requires more than just good intentions. The modern rediscovery of these ancient records represents another turn in the cycle of knowledge loss and recovery that has characterized human development since the earliest times. Each generation rediscovers fragments of inherited wisdom, applies them to contemporary challenges, and faces the responsibility of preserving essential knowledge for future generations who will face similar challenges in different forms. The question isn't whether we'll face future disruptions to our current knowledge systems. The question is whether we'll learn from the wisdom encoded in humanity's oldest preservation strategies and develop our own systematic approaches to maintaining essential knowledge across periods of potential discontinuity. The ancient survivors of the last great catastrophe left us detailed instructions. The question is whether we're wise enough to follow them. The weight of this realization settles over us like dust from an ancient library. We're not the first people to face an uncertain future. We're not the first generation to wonder whether our knowledge will survive us. We're not even the first to discover that our entire understanding of human history might be incomplete. What we are is the latest in a long line of inheritors, working with fragments passed down through cycles of collapse and reconstruction that stretch back further than we ever imagined. When you stand in the ruins of Uruk today, when you touch the fired brick walls that Gilgamesh's workers laid over 4,000 years ago, you're not just touching ancient architecture, you're touching the physical evidence of humanity's first successful attempt to encode survival wisdom into permanent form. Every brick was placed with intention, every wall was oriented with purpose, every foundation was designed to endure not just decades or centuries, but millennia. The people who built these structures understood something we're only beginning to rediscover. That civilization is not inevitable, that knowledge is not permanent, that the line between order and chaos is far thinner than we like to believe. They built not just for themselves, but for us, for the future generations who would eventually uncover their work and need to understand what they had learned about surviving catastrophe. The astronomical alignments embedded in these ancient monuments serve as more than religious symbols or architectural flourishes. They function as permanent calendars, independent backup systems for essential knowledge that agricultural societies require to survive. When you align a temple to mark the winter solstice, you're creating a timekeeper that will function for thousands of years without maintenance, without specialists, without institutional support. Even if the priests disappear and the written records are destroyed, the building itself continues to mark the critical moments in the agricultural cycle. This redundant approach to knowledge preservation appears throughout the post-catastrophe world. Critical information wasn't stored in single locations or entrusted to individual experts. It was distributed across multiple formats, embedded in multiple institutions, encoded in multiple symbolic systems. The same astronomical data appears in written tables, architectural alignments, religious ceremonies, and mythological narratives. Each format serves as a backup for the others, ensuring that essential knowledge could survive even if most of the preservation systems failed. The mathematical principles that govern these ancient societies reveal similar strategic thinking. The base 60 system that appeared with the first cities wasn't chosen randomly. It's perfectly suited for astronomical calculation, geometric construction, and administrative accounting. More importantly, it's a system that can be learned and applied without requiring understanding of the deeper mathematical principles that generated it. People can use inherited formulas effectively even if they don't fully comprehend the underlying theory. This distinction between application and understanding explains many of the puzzling aspects of ancient knowledge systems. Advanced techniques appearing without apparent developmental pathways, sophisticated principles being applied but not extended, complex systems functioning effectively but gradually declining in precision over time. The pattern of people working with inherited tools whose original purposes they only partially understood. The flood narratives that appear throughout ancient literature encode this same practical wisdom in mythological form. When you strip away the supernatural elements, these stories contain detailed protocols for community survival during catastrophic events. The importance of advanced preparation, the necessity of resource stockpiling, the techniques for maintaining social cohesion during periods of extreme stress, the methods for preserving essential knowledge when normal institutions collapse. The ark in these narratives represents more than a boat for saving animals. It symbolizes the systematic selection of what can be preserved when everything familiar is being destroyed, the hard choices about what to save and what to sacrifice, the recognition that survival requires both material preparation and cultural continuity, the understanding that rebuilding requires not just physical resources, but the knowledge systems necessary to organize and apply those resources effectively. When Gilgamesh seeks out the flood survivor in the ancient epic, he's asking questions that transcend individual mortality. How do you maintain hope when everything you've worked for can be destroyed? How do you prepare for challenges you've never faced? How do you preserve meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to human concerns? These aren't abstract philosophical inquiries. These are practical questions about institutional survival that every generation must answer. The responses encoded in these ancient narratives provide surprisingly concrete guidance. Build for permanence, not convenience. Distribute critical knowledge across multiple systems. Maintain diversity in all aspects of social organization. Prepare for disruption even during periods of apparent stability. Focus on what's essential rather than what's comfortable. Accept that not everything can be preserved, but ensure that enough survives to enable reconstruction. This practical wisdom explains why these ancient stories have remained compelling across thousands of years of cultural change. They're not just entertaining narratives or religious teachings, they're survival manuals disguised as mythology, emergency protocols encoded in permanent literary form, instructions for maintaining human civilization across periods of catastrophic disruption. The deliberate burial of sites like Göbekli Tepe represents the most sophisticated expression of this preservation strategy. When the builders covered their magnificent temple complex with tons of soil and rubble, they weren't abandoning a failed project. They were creating a time capsule, ensuring that future generations would eventually rediscover physical evidence of capabilities that might otherwise be completely forgotten. The timing of this burial is significant. It occurs precisely at the moment when the immediate post-catastrophe emergency was ending and normal agricultural civilization was becoming established, as if the builders understood that their emergency knowledge preservation project was no longer needed for immediate survival, but would be essential for future generations who might face similar challenges. This kind of long-term strategic thinking appears throughout the archaeological record of the post-catastrophe world. Monument builders who constructed their works to survive millennia, language preservers who designed writing systems for maximum durability, knowledge encoders who embedded essential information in multiple permanent formats, all working with the understanding that their immediate successors might not need this preserved wisdom, but their distant descendants almost certainly would. The gradual transformation of these practical preservation systems into religious and cultural traditions reflects the natural process by which survival wisdom becomes institutional knowledge. As immediate threats recede, as new generations grow up without direct experience of catastrophe, the urgent practical guidance becomes ritualized, symbolized, mythologized. The content is preserved, but its original emergency context becomes increasingly abstract. This transformation process explains why ancient religious traditions contain so much practical wisdom about community organization, resource management, and social coordination. These weren't arbitrary rules imposed by supernatural authorities. They were survival strategies developed by people who understood that human societies face recurring challenges that require systematic preparation and coordinated response. The social institutions that emerged in the post-catastrophe world were specifically designed to maintain these survival traditions across generational changes. Priesthoods that preserved astronomical knowledge through ritual observance, educational systems that maintained technical skills through apprenticeship programs, legal frameworks that protected specialized knowledge while ensuring its practical application, political structures that could coordinate long-term projects spanning multiple human lifetimes. These weren't primitive societies slowly learning social organization through trial and error. These were mature institutional responses to the challenge of maintaining complex knowledge systems across periods of potential disruption. Every aspect of early civilization appears optimized for cultural continuity rather than short-term efficiency. The writing systems that emerged during this period reveal the same strategic priorities. Clay tablets weren't chosen because they were convenient or cheap. They were chosen because they're virtually indestructible. Fire hardens them instead of destroying them. Water can't dissolve them. Time preserves them better than any other medium available to ancient peoples. When you're encoding knowledge for future generations who might face similar catastrophes, durability matters more than elegance. The redundant copying practices that characterized ancient scribal traditions serve the same preservation function. Critical texts weren't stored in single copies or entrusted to individual libraries. They were copied multiple times, distributed across multiple locations, maintained by multiple institutions. This systematic redundancy ensured that essential knowledge could survive even if most of the preservation systems were destroyed. The cuneiform archives discovered at sites across the ancient world demonstrate the effectiveness of this approach. Thousands of tablets preserving everything from astronomical observations to mathematical calculations to administrative procedures to literary narratives. Multiple copies of the same texts, ensuring that accidental damage or deliberate destruction couldn't eliminate essential information entirely. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself exemplifies this preservation strategy. Multiple versions exist from different time periods and different locations. Each copy varies slightly in details, but the core narrative remains consistent across centuries of transmission. This isn't accidental variation due to copying errors. This is systematic preservation, ensuring that the essential story survives, even if individual versions are lost or corrupted. The mathematical precision embedded within these literary narratives reveals another layer of preservation sophistication. The numerical relationships between story elements, the astronomical alignments referenced in mythological contexts, the geometric principles encoded in architectural descriptions. Essential technical knowledge preserved within narrative frameworks that could survive cultural changes that might eliminate purely technical documents. This integration of practical knowledge with compelling storytelling represents one of humanity's most effective information preservation technologies. Stories are memorable in ways that technical manuals are not. Narratives can cross cultural boundaries that might stop administrative documents. Mythological frameworks can preserve essential information even when the original technical context is completely forgotten. The modern rediscovery of ancient technical knowledge through archaeological investigation and textual analysis demonstrates the long-term effectiveness of these preservation strategies. Information encoded in permanent materials thousands of years ago is still recoverable by people with completely different languages, completely different cultural contexts, completely different technological capabilities. The preservation systems worked exactly as designed. But this rediscovery also reveals how much knowledge can be lost even when preservation efforts are successful. We can read the ancient texts, but we've lost much of the contextual understanding that gave them meaning. We can excavate the ancient sites, but we can only guess at many of the purposes they served. We can decipher the mathematical tablets, but we're still discovering techniques and applications that ancient peoples took for granted. This partial recovery demonstrates both the success and the limitations of any knowledge preservation system. Information can survive across enormous gaps in time and culture, but context is far more fragile. Future generations can inherit the tools, but they must rediscover how to use them. They can recover the formulas, but they must relearn their applications. They can reconstruct the techniques, but they must redevelop the wisdom to apply them appropriately. The ancient warnings about cyclical catastrophe take on new urgency when viewed from this perspective. Not primitive superstition about divine punishment, but practical wisdom about the recurring challenges that human societies face. The recognition that what has been built can be destroyed, that what has been learned can be forgotten, and that each generation inherits both the achievements and the responsibilities of those who came before. Understanding this cyclical pattern transforms how we interpret our current global situation. The technological capabilities we've developed, the social institutions we've created, the knowledge systems we depend on, all represent the latest phase in humanity's ongoing effort to preserve and extend inherited wisdom across generational boundaries. We're not starting from scratch any more than our ancestors did. We're working with fragments passed down through multiple cycles of loss and recovery. The climate changes we're experiencing, the social disruptions we're witnessing, the technological challenges we're facing. These aren't unprecedented crises requiring completely novel solutions. They're the latest versions of recurring challenges that human societies have faced throughout history. The specific details change, but the underlying patterns remain consistent. The ancient survivors of the Younger Dryas impact faced climate catastrophe, social collapse, and technological disruption on a scale that dwarfs our current challenges. Yet they not only survived but developed systematic approaches to knowledge preservation that allowed their descendants to rebuild and eventually surpass what had been lost. Their strategies worked. Their wisdom proved effective across thousands of years and multiple cycles of cultural change. The question facing our generation is whether we'll learn from their example and develop our own systematic approaches to preserving essential knowledge across periods of potential disruption. The tools available to us are more sophisticated than anything available to ancient peoples. Our understanding of the challenges is more comprehensive. Our capacity for coordination and information sharing is unprecedented in human history, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you maintain cultural continuity across generational boundaries when the supporting systems are fragile and the future is uncertain? How do you preserve essential knowledge in forms that can survive technological change, social disruption, and cultural transformation? How do you prepare future generations for challenges you can anticipate but cannot fully predict? The answers are encoded in humanity's oldest preservation strategies, tested across thousands of years of application, proven effective through multiple cycles of collapse and recovery. The ancient survivors left us detailed instructions. They demonstrated practical techniques. They created working models we can study and adapt. The wisdom is available. The question is whether we're wise enough to apply it. When Gilgamesh finally accepts his mortality at the end of the epic, he doesn't abandon his quest for permanence. Instead, he redirects it toward achievable goals. He returns to Uruk and focuses on building something that will outlast his individual life. Walls that will protect future generations. Institutions that will preserve essential knowledge. Stories that will carry wisdom across time. He chooses legacy over longevity. Meaning over immortality. This transformation represents humanity's most mature response to the challenge of living in a finite world with infinite aspirations. The recognition that individual lives are brief, but that human achievements can transcend individual limitations when they're designed for continuity rather than personal glory. The understanding that true immortality comes not from avoiding death, but from contributing to something larger than oneself. The last Anunnaki King becomes the first fully human ruler precisely because he accepts both the burden and the opportunity of mortality. The burden of knowing that everything ends, the opportunity of ensuring that something meaningful survives the ending. His story becomes our story, because it encodes the essential human challenge of creating meaning in the face of uncertainty, preserving knowledge across generational boundaries, and building institutions that can serve purposes larger than individual ambitions. The cosmic catastrophe that ended the Younger Dryas wasn't just a geological event. It was the moment when humanity learned that survival requires more than individual adaptation. It requires systematic cultural preservation, institutional resilience, and the wisdom to prepare for challenges that exceed any individual's capacity to address. The civilizations that emerged in its aftermath weren't primitive beginnings. They were sophisticated responses to the recognition that human societies must be designed for survival across multiple generations and multiple cycles of challenge and recovery. This understanding makes our current global situation both more daunting and more hopeful. More daunting because it reveals how quickly sophisticated societies can collapse when their supporting systems fail. More hopeful because it demonstrates that humans have faced existential challenges before and developed effective strategies for survival and recovery. We are not the first generation to wonder whether human civilization can survive its own success. We are not the first to face the challenge of preserving knowledge across periods of rapid change. We are not the first to recognize that individual efforts may not be sufficient to address collective challenges, but we may be the first generation with sufficient technological capability and historical awareness to apply ancient wisdom to modern challenges systematically and effectively. The question is whether we'll choose to learn from the experience of those who came before us, or whether we'll repeat the cycles of loss and recovery that have characterized human development since the earliest times. The clay tablets are still speaking to us across 5,000 years of transmission. The monuments are still marking the seasons as their builders intended. The stories are still carrying essential wisdom across cultural boundaries and generational changes. The preservation systems designed by the survivors of the last great catastrophe are still functioning exactly as intended. The question isn't whether ancient wisdom remains relevant to modern challenges. The question is whether we're finally ready to listen to what it's been trying to tell us about the nature of survival, the importance of preparation, and the possibility of building human institutions that can endure across the vast scales of time that cosmic challenges require. The last Anunnaki King left us more than an epic poem. He left us a blueprint for how human societies can survive the end of their world and begin again. Whether we use that blueprint effectively will determine whether our descendants remember us as ancestors worth honouring, or as another cautionary tale about civilizations that possessed the knowledge to survive but lacked the wisdom to apply it. The implications stretch beyond archaeological curiosity into the realm of existential preparation, because if we accept that the Younger Dryas impact represents a recurring type of cosmic threat, then the ancient preservation strategies become more than historical artifacts. They become practical protocols for modern application. Consider the sophistication required to maintain astronomical observations across multiple generations of potential disruption. The ancient observers weren't just tracking seasonal changes for agricultural purposes, they were monitoring long-term celestial cycles that could only be detected through continuous observation spanning centuries. The precession of the equinoxes, the variations in planetary orbits, the subtle shifts in star positions that occur over timescales far exceeding individual human lifespans. This kind of systematic long-term observation requires institutional structures specifically designed to survive political changes, economic disruptions, and cultural transformations. The priesthoods that maintained these observations weren't just religious organizations. They were scientific institutions disguised as spiritual traditions, preserving technical knowledge through ritual practices that could continue functioning even when the underlying scientific rationale was forgotten. The mathematical tablets from ancient Babylon demonstrate this principle in action, complex calculations preserved within religious contexts, ensuring their transmission across generations of scribes who might not fully understand their astronomical applications, but could copy them with ritualistic precision. The technical knowledge survives because it's embedded within cultural practices that have their own independent reasons for continuation. This integration of technical and cultural preservation appears throughout the post-catastrophe archaeological record. Medical knowledge encoded within religious healing ceremonies, engineering principles embedded within architectural traditions, agricultural techniques preserved through seasonal festivals. Each system serves dual purposes, maintaining essential practical knowledge while providing cultural meaning that motivates continued participation. The redundancy built into these systems reveals deep understanding of how knowledge preservation actually functions across extended time periods. Critical information wasn't entrusted to single institutions or individual specialists. It was distributed across multiple social structures, each with different survival characteristics, different vulnerabilities, different strengths. If the royal administration collapsed, the priestly schools continued. If the urban centers were destroyed, the rural communities maintained simplified versions of essential techniques. This systematic redundancy explains how advanced knowledge could survive the collapse of the specific civilizations that created it. The techniques persisted in fragmented form across multiple preservation systems, waiting for conditions that would allow full reconstruction. When new centers of learning emerged, they could draw upon these distributed fragments to rebuild comprehensive knowledge systems that often exceeded their immediate practical needs. The astronomical knowledge preserved in ancient texts demonstrates this reconstruction process clearly. Observational data spanning periods much longer than any single cultural tradition, suggesting that different communities had maintained different aspects of a larger astronomical program across centuries of political and cultural change. The eventual synthesis of these fragments produced knowledge systems whose sophistication exceeded what any single community could have developed independently. The same pattern appears in the technological traditions that emerged during the early historical period. Metallurgical techniques that combined innovations from multiple regional traditions, construction methods that integrated architectural principles from diverse cultural sources, mathematical systems that synthesized numerical concepts from different intellectual lineages. The resulting knowledge systems show clear evidence of assembly from multiple independent sources rather than linear development from single origins. This synthetic approach to knowledge recovery explains many of the anomalies that puzzle historians about ancient technological development. Advanced techniques appearing without apparent local developmental pathways, sophisticated principles being applied in contexts that seem too early for their supposed time periods, complex systems demonstrating understanding that exceeds what contemporary educational institutions should have been able to produce. What we're seeing isn't anachronistic knowledge appearing out of nowhere. We're seeing the systematic reconstruction of inherited technical traditions by communities that had access to preserved fragments from multiple independent sources. The apparent sophistication reflects not primitive genius, but mature application of recovered knowledge systems. The social institutions required to coordinate this kind of knowledge reconstruction reveal organizational sophistication that matches the technical achievements they produced. Administrative systems capable of managing resources across multiple communities and extended time periods. Educational programs that could train specialists in reconstructed technical traditions. Legal frameworks that could protect specialized knowledge while ensuring its practical application for community benefit. These weren't primitive societies slowly learning organizational techniques through trial and error. These were mature institutional responses to the specific challenge of rebuilding complex knowledge systems from fragmented sources. Every aspect of early historical civilization appears designed for knowledge recovery rather than knowledge development. The writing systems that emerged during this period serve the same reconstructive function. The earliest texts don't show gradual improvement in writing techniques or slowly expanding vocabulary. They demonstrate immediate application of sophisticated literacy for complex administrative, technical, and literary purposes. This suggests that the writing systems themselves were reconstructions of old communication technologies rather than original innovations. The linguistic evidence supports this interpretation. The technical vocabularies embedded within early written languages contain terms for concepts, processes, and materials that exceed what the immediate cultural context should have required. Metallurgical terminology describing alloy compositions not formally understood until modern chemistry. Astronomical vocabulary, requiring mathematical concepts not officially developed until much later periods. Medical language demonstrating anatomical knowledge typically associated with systematic dissection programs. This advanced technical vocabulary suggests that the languages themselves were vehicles for preserving inherited knowledge, rather than simple communication systems developed for immediate practical needs. The entire linguistic structure appears optimized for technical precision and information preservation rather than casual social interaction. The mythological narratives embedded within these technical traditions serve similar preservation functions. Complex stories that encode practical information about resource management, social organization, and emergency preparedness within memorable narrative frameworks. Tales that seem fantastical on the surface, but contain detailed instructions for maintaining civilization across periods of crisis and reconstruction. When you analyze the flood narratives that appear throughout ancient literature from this perspective, their practical content becomes obvious. Systematic protocols for community survival during catastrophic events, detailed guidance about resource stockpiling, population management, and knowledge preservation. Technical instructions for rebuilding essential infrastructure after social collapse, all encoded within mythological frameworks that ensure transmission across cultural boundaries and generational changes. The ark in these narratives represents the most sophisticated preservation concept of all. Not just a vessel for saving biological diversity, but a systematic approach to cultural continuity across catastrophic disruption. The careful selection of what knowledge, what skills, what social structures, what cultural practices can be preserved when everything familiar is being destroyed. The recognition that survival requires not just material preparation, but institutional design for reconstruction. This understanding transforms how we interpret the technological choices made by ancient civilizations. The massive stone constructions weren't built to impress neighbors or honor gods. They were built to serve as permanent backup systems for essential knowledge. When you construct astronomical alignments into architectural foundations, you're creating timekeeping systems that can function independently of written records, specialized institutions, or cultural continuity. The mathematical principles embedded within these architectural systems ensure that even if the original builder's civilization completely disappears, future peoples can still extract essential astronomical information from the physical structures themselves. The buildings become libraries encoded in stone, preserving critical knowledge in forms that can survive virtually any type of cultural disruption. This architectural approach to knowledge preservation reveals strategic thinking that extends far beyond immediate practical needs. The builders weren't just constructing for their own generation. They were creating permanent repositories for human knowledge, designed to serve future civilizations that might face similar challenges and need access to similar technical information. The scale of some of these preservation projects suggests coordination across multiple communities and extended time periods. Construction programs that required centuries to complete, involving specialized knowledge from multiple technical traditions, supported by economic systems capable of sustaining long-term projects without immediate practical returns. This level of coordinated effort indicates social institutions specifically designed for multi-generational knowledge preservation. The gradual decline of these preservation systems over subsequent centuries reflects the natural entropy that affects all human institutions. As immediate survival pressures decreased, as new generations grew up without direct experience of catastrophic disruption, as the original purposes behind preservation efforts became increasingly abstract, The systematic maintenance of inherited knowledge became increasingly difficult to sustain. The transformation of practical preservation protocols into religious and cultural traditions represents this institutional decay process. The content was preserved, but its original emergency context became increasingly symbolic. Future generations inherited the forms but lost understanding of their original functions. What had been systematic preparation for catastrophic recovery became ritualized cultural practice, yet even in this degraded form the preservation systems continued to function. Religious traditions maintained astronomical observations through ritual calendars. Cultural practices preserved technical knowledge through traditional crafts. Social institutions protected specialized information through professional apprenticeships. The knowledge survived, even when its original context was forgotten. This demonstrates both the strength and the limitation of cultural preservation systems. Information can survive across enormous gaps in time and understanding, but context is far more fragile. Future generations can inherit the tools without understanding their purposes, recover the techniques without grasping their applications, possess the formulas without comprehending their significance. The modern rediscovery of ancient technical knowledge through archaeological investigation reveals this preservation paradox clearly. We can excavate the sites, decipher the texts, analyze the artifacts, reconstruct the techniques. But we're still learning how to interpret the purposes they served, the problems they were designed to solve, the wisdom they were meant to preserve. This partial recovery suggests that we're currently living through another phase of the same cyclical process that has characterized human development since the earliest times. Inheriting fragments of inherited wisdom, working to reconstruct comprehensive understanding from incomplete sources, preparing our own preservation systems for future generations who will face similar challenges in different forms. The story of the last Anunnaki King isn't ending with this video, it's beginning with your awakening to what we really are. We're not the first civilization to reach for the stars, to encode knowledge into permanent forms, to face the terrifying possibility that everything we've built could vanish in a cosmic instant. We're the latest inheritors of a preservation system that has been functioning for over 13,000 years, carrying the memory of catastrophe forward through cycles of collapse and recovery that stretch back to the very foundations of human consciousness. Tonight, you've glimpsed the truth that changes everything. Civilization doesn't progress in straight lines. It spirals through cycles of remembering and forgetting, building and rebuilding, preserving and losing what matters most. The clay tablets beneath Mesopotamian sands, the stone circles rising from forgotten fields, the flood myths whispered in every corner of the world all carry the same message: prepare, preserve, remember, because the sky has fallen before and will fall again. Whether we learn from Gilgamesh's journey or repeat his tragedy depends entirely on what we do with this knowledge. The last Anunnaki King showed us that true immortality comes not from escaping death, but from encoding wisdom into forms that outlast the flesh. His legacy isn't written in gold or carved in marble. It's pressed into clay that still speaks across 5 millennia, waiting for minds ready to hear what survival really means.